Hey guys, HackerSploit here, back again with another video, and welcome back to the exploit development series. In this video, we're going to get started with the C programming language, and the purpose of this video series is to essentially take you through the C programming language and the most important bits that we're going to be using. Now, the reason I'm making this is because in my previous video, I essentially created a simple Stack Overflow. A lot of people did not understand what was going on and what exactly the overflow was, or what essentially they did not get the premise of the overflow. And a lot of people actually told me that they're having problems understanding the C programming language. So this series is not going to cover everything in regards to the C programming language. We're going to be looking at it as we move along. But I wanted to cover the most important bits of it. As I've mentioned in my other previous programming videos or my programming tutorials, I usually like covering the most important bits of a programming language, or the most functional bits that I used the most. So if you know those elements, then the rest is extremely easy to learn and it becomes very intuitive. Now, if this is your first time learning a programming language, I'm going to try and explain it as basic as possible. A lot of you have had experience with other programming languages, for example, like Python, and you've had issues because Python is very, very different in terms of its syntax to the way C is, and C++ really. With Python, it is much more of a flexible language in regards to errors and how to essentially debug it. But when talking about C, there are a lot of things that you need to know and respect in regards to the syntax. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, as I've mentioned already before, I'm just going to give you a bit of a history of the C programming language. So the C programming language was created by Dennis Ritchie. It was created about the same time Ken Thompson was working on the B language. However, as we all know, the C programming language overtook all the others that were in development at the time, and primarily it is being used right now for OS development and also driver development. So it is a it's a very good language to essentially use to develop at a very low level. Okay. Now, when we talk about the C programming language and how the flow of code is, you essentially move from your editor to your compiler to the linker and then the debugger. The most important bits being the compiler and the debugger here. The editor is something that can be customized or can be extremely versatile in regards to the different variations that exist out there. So what am I talking about when I talk about your compiler, linker and debugger? So by default, you have your GNU C compiler. Now, this is the most popular C compiler available out there. It comes pre-installed on Linux distributions, and on Windows, you can get it bundled with integrated development environments such as CodeBlocks, or what I'm using right now is Dev C++. This is also the same for Mac OS if any of you are using that operating system. Alright, so on Windows, which is what I'm using right now, it pretty much comes bundled together in my IDE. So on Windows, it's like a one-stop shop. On Linux, you pretty much need your editor and your compiler and also a debugger. So it would also be wise to essentially have an integrated development environment on Linux, but I tend to enjoy using the Nano editor to essentially write all my code. I then use the GNU C compiler to compile the code, and then finally I run it, and if there are any issues that I need to debug, I take it through a debugger myself or take it through a debugger manually. Now, of course, when we talk about Windows, you have these really awesome IDEs like CodeBlocks or Dev C++, which is what I'm using. So you can go ahead and use any of them, whatever you're comfortable with. They all come with the GNU C compiler. All right, so let us get started now, instead of wasting all this time. So I'm just going to create a new source file right over here, and I'm going to save the source file as, I'm just going to call it test. And I am going to call it, I'm just going to save it as a C source file type right over here, and hit save. And that is going to create our test C file for us. You can rename it to whatever you want. Now, in this video, I want to cover functions and variables and also libraries, which is what we're looking at right now. So when you're talking about libraries essentially give us functionality when using the programming language. They allow us to perform various functions, and they allow us to sort of streamline what functionality we want. For example, most of you have seen me always including, which is I always recommend, is to include your standard library first. This is your standard library, and the standard library is essentially used for basic functionality like declaring variables and assigning them data types, etc. So this is pretty much a must. You then have your, if I can just include it right over here, you then have your standard input-output library, which is pretty self-explanatory. It allows you to, or it gives your program input and output functionality. So that is done by typing in stdio.h. And then you have other libraries that pretty much, again, as I mentioned, extend functionality. So for example, we have the, which is one we'll be using further on in this series. We have the math.h library, which essentially gives us additional mathematical operators that we can use and formulas, etc. We then have the string.h, which allows us to play around with strings and to essentially use strings to a greater extent, or extend our already existing functionality with strings. All right, so those are your libraries, and that is how to essentially include them. So I've talked about your standard library, your standard input-output library, and your string library. So that's what we'll be using right now. Now let's talk about your main function, because this is pretty much where things get interesting. So your main function, and by the way, this is how to essentially initialize or declare a comment here. So you have your main function. All right. So your main function follows a very simple structure, and this is one of the things I really enjoy about going back to C and C++, is the structure exists and the structure is fantastic. So with your main function, you have the return value data type, which could be int, it could be double, whatever data you're trying to return, you can declare it as I'll show you in a second. But for now, let us just keep the main function very simple. So we type in main, and then in the main function, we then have the arguments that we can specify in there. We'll be looking at that in the next set of videos as we move along with functions and we talk about other aspects of the programming language. But for now, we're going to leave the main function as follows. So in C, we essentially declare or initialize the function as follows. So we have the name of the function. The main is the most important function in C. This is essentially where all the code is executed first. So your compiler will execute all of the code in the main function before it does anything else. So that is something very important that you need to understand. So you have your parentheses right over here where we have additional arguments. We'll not be looking at that in this video. And then you have your curly braces, which inside right over here within the function is where you would have your arguments, or you have your function calls. So you can have your code right over here. So we have statements of code. And we have our function calls right over here. So this is where you essentially have the code you want to execute, and this is where you call other functions that exist outside of the main function. So for example, if I created another function right over here, and this had a data return type of integer, and this is the structure of creating a function. So you have your return data type, if there is any. So you have int and then the function name. So I can call this function print text. And we have the option here for arguments that we can specify. In this case, I'm not going to specify anything. And then both the curly braces, and inside here is where we print our instructions. So functions both work the same for the main and the print text function right over here. But the main function is executed first, and this is what will allow us to call any other functions that we want to run. So let's say I wanted to print out text. So if you want to print out text in C, we use the printf command. All right. So printf, you open up your parentheses and you have your double quotation marks, and in here we type in any text that we want to print out. You can also you can type in variables, values, etc. So in here I would type in, for example, hello, welcome to the C programming language, something very generic like that. I know a lot of you guys don't enjoy it when I print hello world, so this is something new. All right, so this is what this function is going to do. The purpose of this function is to print out the following. Its job is to print out the following text right over here. Simple enough. But something interesting happens. So let me just hit save. By the way, if you want to save on Windows, you can use your Ctrl+S keys on your keyboard, and that will save all the changes that you've made to your file. And then you can go ahead and rebuild all over here, and it's going to start processing and compiling, and it's going to give you your compilation results. So you have 0 errors, 0 warnings. Great. And you have your output file name, the output size, and the compilation time. And finally, we can compile and run the code once more. You can see that it does not print out the text. And you might be wondering why. Why is it doing that? And that's because we haven't called the function in the main function. We haven't called the print text function in the main function. Remember when I said that the main function is executed first. This function decides what other functions will run. So for example, I can print here, I can say printf, and I can say main function. So will essentially prove that this was executed in the main function. So I'll save this and I'll rebuild all and wait for that to finish compiling, and I'm going to compile and run it one more time. You can see that it will print out what is within the main function. But if we want to print out what is within the print text function, we need to call the function. So to call the function, we simply type the function name and any arguments that we want to specify along with it. In this case, we are not specifying anything, and remember to specify the semicolon right over here. All right, so now you'll see that let me change this text so we know that the code is being executed in the print text function. So we can say print text function, and this will prove that this text has been executed correctly, or the function has been called. So I'll rebuild and I will compile and run. And as you can see right over here, it's going to tell you main function and print text function. So it was both the functions were executed, and the print text function was executed because we provided a function call. All right, so that is essentially the basics of functions. We'll be looking at the data type return types. But for now, another thing that you guys pointed out is you guys pointed out the return type, and essentially when we're talking about returning data. So many of you pointed out or were asking what the return 0 does. All right, so let's start off with that. So the return 0 is used to test whether a function has been executed correctly. Let me show you what I mean. So if the main function executes correctly, I want it to return a value of 0. So that way we know that the main function executed correctly. So I'm just going to rebuild all, and we're going to wait for that to complete, and I'm going to hit compile and run. You can see that it will tell us right over here, the process exited after 0.1669 seconds with a return value of 0. So that means, yes, our function executed correctly and there were no errors. You will find that if it gives you another value right over here, it means there's a problem with your function and you probably need to take a look at it. All right, so those are functions. So let me just go over the structure one more time. So your main function, and I know a lot of you will be asking, where are the arguments provided within the main function? You know, we have by the syntax, we need to actually provide our arguments. So you know, we usually say int argc, etc. I'll be looking at that in the next video. For now, let's try and understand everything as we move along. All right, so the structure for functions, you have your return data type right over here, the name of the function, any arguments you want to provide, and then you have your statements or the code you want to execute. And in the main function, you can call other functions right over here. We'll be looking at calling other functions as we move along. For now, let's talk about variables now, as we've already looked at functions. So variables are extremely simple when we in the C programming language, and a lot of people get confused with declaration, initialization, and then providing a value. All right, so what are variables? Variables are essentially used to store pieces of information or values that can be changed. Remember, there's a difference between a variable and a constant. The value of a variable can be changed within the program and also as the code is being executed. So let's say, let me get rid of this function right over here and the code over here. So in here, I can say, for example, or actually I'll show you how to declare the variables before we look into that. So in the main function, or within any function, declaring variables is very simple. Now there is two types of declaration. You have your public and private declaration. You have variables that are declared globally, so variables that can be used by all the functions within the program, and then you have private variables, or variables that can be used only within one function. So let us stick to one of them. Now, when we talk about the variable data types, in C we have 4 of the main ones. We have int, which is used to store integer values and usually has a size of 4 bytes, which is pretty self-explanatory. A lot of you should know this. You then have your float, which is used to store floating point numbers or decimals, which again has a value of 4 bytes. You then have your character, which is used to store a single character. We'll be looking at strings. So this has a value of 1 byte. It is used to store a single character of A or B or whatever you want to use. You then have your double, which is again used to store, it is used to store floating point numbers or decimals or large decimal numbers that require a larger space or size. And this has a size of about 8 bytes, if I'm correct. Alright, so those are the different data types you can use in C. Now, when we talk about variable declaration or variable initialization, you have the variable data type, you have the variable name, and you have the initialization if you want to give it a value. So for example, I can initialize a variable in multiple ways. So I can say, for example, int a, remember the structure is as follows. You have your data type, the variable name, and the optional initialization. So I can say int a, all right, that is a variable. Now this variable is not initialized because it does not have a value, all right, but I can go just below it and say int a equal 10, all right, and of course I'm using the data type of integer, which is appropriate to the value. This would be incorrect if I would be, using a string and I would say something like 10, because the data type is very specific. Remember, in Python, your data types are sort of automatically declared, or it already knows what data that you're printing out and automatically declares your data type for you. You can do it manually, but with C, you need to specify everything manually. So this is of data type integer. Now that means that this value can only be an integer. So you have your value 10 right over there. So that is an integer. That's perfect. And then right down over here, I can say printf, and I can say I want to print the value, or I want to print the variable a. Now the thing about printing variables in C, if I was to just hit a, just to enter a and close that up, and I'll also return 0 here just to see that everything is working correctly, and I rebuild all here, you'll see something interesting happening here. Well, first of all, you'll see that warning, passing arguments 1 of printf makes pointer from integer without a cast. Alright, let me explain what this is. When you're printing out a variable, the data type is very important. Now if you're printing out a decimal value, you need to specify this. So to specify this, we use the different format symbols that have different meanings, which means we are going to print out a variable or a value of decimal or string, of string or decimal data type. It's a bit confusing, but let me explain. So let's say I want to print out my variable a. The variable a is of data type integer. So to do this, I need to use the symbol d. All right. So the %d is used to specify the type of data that you're trying to print out. In this case, it's saying I am printing out a decimal data type or a variable. So I use a comma and then specify the variable. Now that I've specified the variable, it should print it out just fine. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to rebuild all of this. And well, for some reason telling me, all right, yeah, I think I know what the issue is. I'll get to this in a second. And that is because I actually declared it twice. So a is going to be equal to 10. And that is the initialization. Sorry about that, guys. So I've given it a value right over here. Now you can do that in the same line as I mentioned. I actually also forgot to do that. So this is how to initialize a variable and give it a value in the same line. So we say int a is going to be equal to 10. All right. So now if we rebuild all and we compile it, we'll wait for that to compile and then we can run it. You can see that it's going to print out the value of a for us. Now let me explain sort of what we've looked at, because I know a lot of you guys are getting confused. So for example, we took a look at variables. We have variable data types, int, double, float, and character. Now we're going to look at character right now when we talk about strings. And then to print out your variables or any number, you need to specify the data type it is. So for example, if it is a value or a variable that is decimal, then you need to use the %d. If you're printing out a string value, use the %s. So I can change this a little bit. I can say, what if I wanted to print out the number 10 here? Very, very simple stuff. And I rebuild this. Let me just rebuild this here. And you can see we've got an error here, which is giving us the same error telling us that we are printing out an integer without a cast. So we need to actually provide these formats. So to do this again, we provide it with a %d and comma and the value that we want to print out, which we can say is 10. Or 100, because the integer value or the integer data type is pretty huge. So I'm going to rebuild all, and as you can see, 0 errors this time. And if we run it, there we are. It printed out the data for us. Excellent. So that is essentially how to initialize variables and how to print them out. Now let's take a look at the character data type, because this is where people for some reason get really confused. And this is not to say that this language is difficult, but it gets quite confusing when you move on to stuff like this. Alright, so I'm going to now create a simple test program that will sort of encapsulate all that we've learned in this video. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say the following. So let me get rid of all of this and this comment right over here, or I'll actually leave the comments. So we'll get rid of all the data. So this program, the purpose of this program is to essentially print out the name of a person and their age. Alright, so we have already looked at declaring variables within a main function. Now, if you want to declare them externally or globally, you can also do it as follows. Let me just get rid of that code marker right over there. So that is the main function. Now, when we talk about declaring external variables, which is also something I should have looked at, you use the external command, and then you provide the data type, which is int. And since we're initializing it in one line, we can say int age equal 20. So we've initialized a variable externally with the data type of integer, the name of age, and the value of 20. So that pretty much means that this variable is storing the value of age. Now, when we talk about strings, you saw me use this in the simple Stack Overflow, where if you're storing a string, you still use the character data type, but you need to specify how many characters you're using. Remember, the character data type will only store one, is only allowed to store one right over here. Okay, so for now, let me just show you a simple example. Let's say I declared a variable here of a character name, and that is going to be equal to I'll call it Alexis here. All right, and that is how to specify you're using more than one character. Use double quotation marks. If you're using one character, then you would use single quotation marks. So let's say I type in Alexis here, and then I go right over here and say printf, and I'm just going to say, remember the syntax that I told you about. I will say, for example, %s, and right over here, I give the name of the variable, which is name, and that should print it out, right? Well, let's see if that actually does it. So let me just include the return 0 here, save, rebuild all, wait for that. You can see there's an error already. And again, it's going to tell us that age initialized and declared externally. Which is fine. Do not worry about that. That's simply a warning. You then have your initialization mix integer from pointer without cast, again telling us something here. So if I'm to run this, you can see that's going to give us a null value, which is not what we want. So when you're talking about initializing strings or variables that are storing more than one character with the character data type, we need to specify in the square brackets the length of the word or the amount of characters you want to use. In this case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can type in 6, but to be safe, I would like to type in 10. Now you can see that if I'm to just let me just hit enter right over here. So if I was to put in something like 3 here, it's obviously going to exceed, which means only 3 of them will be stored in the variable, and the rest will essentially experience an overflow. So let me save this here. I'm going to rebuild all, and we'll wait for this. Actually looking for the overflow, but for now, let's just stick with this. All right. So if I just change it now to, for example, 10. That essentially has more characters than I've provided, that will print it out just fine. So let me just show you that right now. So I'm just going to rebuild all, and don't worry about the external variable that is initialized here. So I'm just going to run it. It's going to print it out now for us. So Alexis, there, fantastic. So now that we know about characters and strings and how to declare strings with the data type of character, or the char data type, we can now move along into creating our simple program or our simple script that will essentially print out the name and the age of a person. All right, so I'm going to now declare the character or the name variable right over here, and again I'm going to provide it a length of 10, and I'm just going to now print out Alexis. All right, and remember to use the semicolon right over there to end it. And we'll now get rid of all of this code right over here, and we'll create another function, and we will call this function. Of course, it's not going to return any. It's not going to return data of the data type. It's not going to return any value of the data type integer. I'm just using that as a simple example. So this is going to print text, as we mentioned, no arguments that we want to specify there. I'm going to open up that function now. And within here is where I would print out, or I would use these variables to print out the data. So in here, I would simply type in printf, and in here I would say my name is, and I use the s because we are printing out the I'm printing out the name variable, which is a string. So we use the %s. And if we want to break a line, if we want to go a line below us, as you know with any other programming language, or to move to a new line, we use the N command, which a lot of you guys know if you've been doing C programming or C++. And then out here, we use the comma and the variable name. All right, so we provide the variable name and we close that up. And again, right over here, printf, we say, and my age, and we can say I am, and my age is, and we use the %d because we are printing out a value of integer right over here. So we then move this out here, and we say the variable age right over here, and that should print it out for us. Now again, as I mentioned, if we do not call the function, none of this will be printed out. So let me just rebuild. Do not worry if you get any errors. I'll explain why we're getting an error telling us that age is initialized and declared externally. Don't worry about that. We're just going to run this, and you can see it's not going to print anything, and that is because of the function call. So just over here, we're going to call the function. So we're going to say print, and we're going to say text, print text right over here. We've called the function, and the main function is going to be executed first, and is going to call this function, and this function is going to be called, and is going to print out the data that we want using the externally initialized variables that we provided right over here. So I'm going to rebuild all right over here. And do not worry about the warnings. We'll take a look at this in the next video when we talk about advanced stuff like the string copy and accepting user input. So I'm going to run this, and as you can see, it prints it out for us. My name is Alexis, and my age is 20. Of course, this is very simple program. Now that you understand how functions work and variable initialization and your libraries, we can now move on to something a little bit better, because the main reason I wanted to explain this is because we're going to be looking at creating reverse shells with C, and it's very important that you get or grasp the aspects of functions here. All right, so let me just summarize what we've looked at. So we took a look at your standard libraries or your libraries and how to include them, and how each of them gives you functionality that you want or that you're looking for. All right. We then looked at initializing variables, where we took a look at initializing variables locally and externally as follows, and we took a look at the different data types. We then took a look at the main function and how the main function essentially controls or we will decide what code is going to be executed and displayed. And we looked at the structure of a function in regards to its return data type, the name of the function, and any other arguments that we're going to look at later. So again, that is pretty much all there is to learn in regards to functions, but there is a bit more which we'll cover as we move along. And also in regards to variables, that's pretty much it. So we've looked at quite a lot in this video, and I'll keep the next video in this series quite short because I want to move really quickly now. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you found value in this video, please leave a like down below. If you have any questions or suggestions, let me know in the comment section on my social networks, or you can let me know via email as well. I do also respond to messages that way. That being said, I'll be seeing you in the next video. Peace guys.